So in our last video, I was talking about saw sharpening, and I said I wanted to do a video a little more detailed about troubleshooting with saw sharpening. Oftentimes, you'll be working with a saw and you'll find suddenly something's acting a little off. It's starting to veer in your kerf. Let's say you're doing a rip in a board and it constantly pulls to the right, and you're like correcting and you're torquing it. You're struggling with it. Other times, when you're cutting a long kerf, you'll find that the tip of your saw will start to buzz as you pull it back up through the kerf. It's like, and you increase in pitch because the end of the saw starts buzzing as it comes through the kerf. So these are some weird things that you deal with sometimes with saws, especially after it's worn a little bit. Maybe you've freshly set it, you freshly sharpened it, and it's working great, and then it starts to do these things. So these are all things that you can figure out with some basic troubleshooting. So I'll start with binding. So typically when a saw starts binding in a kerf, it's because of one of two things. Either your set is not sufficient, and again, by set, I mean the splay of the teeth off the center line of the saw. You need a little more set to prevent bending, or the plate itself there's too much friction between it and what you're cutting. So that is very simple to fix. We keep blocks of wax around the shop. This is just basic old beeswax. Now, this is an old saw. This is not tuned up. I'm using this for to demonstrate some of these techniques today. So I can demonstrate every one of these techniques on this poor little saw, and then it'll need some TLC after this. But to wax a plate, you just take the wax and you run it on the surface of both sides. And as you're sawing, the saw plate heats up a little bit. It's usually not noticeable, but it will cause this wax to spread a little, to fill out the pores a bit. It'll move it around on the saw plate to the areas that need it most, and you'll find it starts to cut a lot more easily. So if the issue is not enough set, in the last video I said I like setting the saw before sharpening, but you can always go back and add a little bit more set after it's sharpened. One of the questions that I got from the last video was, how much of the tooth are you setting? When you take your saw set like this one and you're placing it on the tooth, what are you looking to move? Are you looking to bend the entire tooth? Are you looking to bend just the tip of the tooth over? And in reality, a lot of these saw sets are made so that they rest on the tooth line. So the portion of the tooth that's being pushed is actually pretty well fixed, but you're aiming to bend the top 2/3 of the tooth, really. You're not trying to bend the tooth down at its base. That will require a lot of effort. You're just looking to splay the tooth out a little so that it can cut that wider kerf. So those two things are really the classic causes of binding, and those are the easy fixes for binding. Now, another one that you will encounter, as I mentioned in the last video and already in this one, is sometimes your kerf starts to pull. You'll be ripping through a board and you find that you have to correct. It's like I said, it's like driving a car down the highway that's misaligned, and you basically have the wheel turned all the time to keep it straight. And though you can do it, it becomes annoying, and it's not really good for you and for your attitude. It might not damage the saw, but it's just not that efficient. So that usually happens because a saw is overset on one side. That can happen for a variety of reasons. One could be how it's stowed in your toolbox. Maybe it allows for some other tools to bump into the teeth and either bend them in a smidge or wear them down a smidge so that there's less set on one side than the other. Could be from, being dropped, or who knows, but what you have to do is then look at, okay, is my saw overset? Is there a little too much set on one side? So it is hard to reverse set once you have it, but there is one way that you can remove a little bit of set very quickly, and that is just taking the file, or you can take something like a diamond hone. That's a really good way of doing this very lightly. you take the side to which it is wandering, right? So if this saw keeps trying to wander right, I'm going to guess that there's too much set on the right-hand side. So what I'm going to do is just place it here and take my saw. I'm going to run against the teeth, and carefully, so I don't get my fingertips on there, I'm just going to take a light pass, maybe another light pass. And I'm going to try that. Now, 2 passes like that might just be enough. You might need a little bit more. If you find that you feel like you have to go aggressively, I would suggest looking at resetting the whole saw again, because if you feel that you need to remove all the set on one side, you might have to revisit sharpening and everything else. So it might require starting over from the beginning. As I did in the last video, you start with totally setting the saw both sides and then resharpening. Because this is for tuning up a misalignment. It's not for totally fixing a saw that really actually needs reset and resharpened. So that's that. I also got some questions, and these are very good questions. I really appreciate all the feedback, by the way, both here and in the dispatch for further questions for saw sharpening. One of the questions I got was, how do you both sharpen and set a very fine saw? And so I have a few examples. This is what you might call the typical throwaway hardware store saw. This is a Japanese pull saw. These things work great out of the box, and then they wear out, and pretty soon you just have to get rid of them. They're really, the teeth are usually electro-hardened, so it's very difficult to sharpen these. The other thing about them is, because we Westerners have our built-in centuries of muscle memory of pushing saws through a kerf, we tend to bind these, because you're supposed to draw these through a kerf very carefully, like, you know, pulling a blade of grass through. And we tend to get going like this, and we're pushing as hard as we are pulling. And you can very easily kink this saw plate, because these are thin plates. And so once it's bent, you can't really straighten it. So this is an example of very fine teeth. It works great. You can't really sharpen this kind of saw. There are Ryoba saws and traditional Japanese saws that you can resharpen. But this steel and this style of hardened teeth is not really conducive to resharpening. Unless you really want to get specialized in your sharpening stones and your setup. For example, if you want to get some magnifiers like this, this is what you'd use if you really wanted to go to town to resharpen one of these, or if you have a really fine-toothed Western saw, like a dovetail saw or something like that. A lot of people say, how on earth do I get in there when I have, you know, 15 TPI? Or more. Like, these are really fine and hard to see. And I agree, that has nothing to do with aging eyes or anything like that. So what you need is more light, more magnification, and smaller files. So you would go with a smaller triangular file for that. You need to get in close, you need more magnification. Setting is the same thing. You will need a smaller and finer saw set than what you would use for a bigger saw. One other thing that people regularly encounter in use with their hand saws is the handle starts to get loose. So this is a really nice old saw. I really like this one. This has split nuts, and you can just feel a little bit of looseness right now. It's not a big deal. It wouldn't really affect your work much, but that can start to get to you. You feel just a little clink, 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 clink. So the 2 styles of screws that you find in saws are, of course, the regular slotted and then the split nut. And so what you don't want to do is use the wrong size screwdriver to tighten those, which will then tear out the head and make it much more difficult the next time you need to adjust this. But these are very easy to tighten to remove that looseness. So for a slotted, you would just get a regular small flathead screwdriver, and you can modify these. Usually these nuts, these screws in saws, are very, very fine slot. It's very thin. A regular flathead is too fat, or it tapers too quickly to fit in there. So you can file that down, you can grind it down, you can hone it down, make it nice and fine so it fits in. If you have split nuts, you need a split nut screwdriver. So again, if you want to, you can make one of these out of a flathead or slotted screwdriver. You can just file that relief in there so that it fits into your slotted nuts, and then you can tighten as needed and make the saw much more rugged in feel. It won't bother you nearly as much. So that's a quick tune-up. Oftentimes you find in the wintertime, as wood moves seasonally, it shrinks down a little bit, and you need to tighten those up just so you don't feel that sloppiness. Another thing that we hear is, I've sharpened my saw. I have this great old saw. It's nice and straight, but the teeth are irregular. And I want to see if you can get in here and look at the tooth pattern on this saw. If you look close, you can see that there are bigger teeth and smaller teeth in a repeating pattern. It's irregularly sharpened. And what happens, the reason that happens is because as you're going down one side of the saw, the file is applying pressure to both the face of one tooth and the back of the one in front of it. And so if a person is going right-handed than left-handed, they might be applying more pressure to the back of the teeth down one side of the saw than the other, and that creates skinny teeth and fat teeth. And I will say, in use, this saw cuts great. It's nice and sharp. It's not really an issue performance-wise. So I would say for all of these things, for binding and stuff like that, judge the saw by its performance, not necessarily by how it looks. If an irregular tooth pattern cuts fine, just keep going. And you can actually start to fix this in future sharpenings. Pay really close attention to the fact that you only want to be putting pressure on the face of the tooth you're sharpening and not the back of the next one. And so within a few sharpenings, you'll be able to start evening those teeth out. You won't have to go to an extreme of taking all the teeth off and cutting new ones. That usually isn't necessary for a user saw like this. One final thing I want to talk about before we go is if you have a saw that gets bent. And that is a sad situation. I'm not talking about just kind of the cheap throwaway. I'm talking about your old classic, right? The one that you love, you bring everywhere you go, right? It sleeps on your pillow next to you. You're sawing something, it gets bound, it bows, you look at it, and suddenly it's not so straight. There is an art and a science to saw straightening, and I'm just going to skim the surface today because the fact is most people don't really understand what's going on when you straighten a saw, myself included. I'll go over here to the anvil. A lot of you might not have an anvil in your shop, but for really basic rudimentary saw straightening, if you have a slight bow, you don't need an anvil. You could use something like a stump or a block of wood that is a very straight cut across the end grain. And you'll be doing this on the end grain of that stump if you don't have something like an anvil. Now, this anvil, nice and flat, that's what you want. For a hammer, this ball peen hammer is a good candidate. It's pretty heavy. I don't know, it's probably a couple pounds. Some people suggest a bigger hammer, like a lump hammer or small sledgehammer. Some people will move to a smaller, like a cross peen or something like that. As long as your hammer surface is slightly convex, that's good. You don't want to leave hammer marks all over your saw. And so what you're doing is you're going to, gotta grab my chalk, you're going to sight down your saw and find the bow, right? I have a very subtle bow here. In fact, it might not bother the performance of the saw. So if you feel like you have bent it or bowed it, give it a try, give it a few more strokes, make sure it's an issue before you try and correct it. We have a subtle bow, so about in that area. Like I would say the center of it is in here. So determining where the bow is, you got to check it to make sure you're looking in the right spot. So this is the center of what the work I'm going to be doing, and you work outward. So some people think of this as like work hardening. Like when you burnish a scraper, you actually harden the surface. Some people would call this like tensioning a saw plate. Some people say there's this process called hammer shrinking, where the impacts of the hammer actually draw metal towards that point and cause tension to form in this side, which this is like if it's bowed, it's stretched on this side. And when you introduce tension, you're actually straightening it because this side has more tension than this side. And so it corrects, it straightens. However, you could just call it magic. It works the same way. And no one really has a clear answer of exactly what's going on when you do this. But suffice that to say, if I want to straighten this, I'll lay my saw plate over the anvil. I would tip it up just a little bit to kind of get a bit of a reverse of the bow in there. And you want to just bounce your hammer down the middle of the plate. Okay, make sure you stay on your anvil, don't drift off. You don't want to hit off the edge and bend your plate over. And check it. Now you're going to move down towards the tooth line. Bounce your hammer. Check it. It's already actually coming out. Work back up towards the spine and bounce it. And honestly, you probably won't be able to see that, but I would say I am not worried about that any longer. In use, this will probably perform like new. That straightened it right out. So those are some tips for troubleshooting saw sharpening, regular saw problems that you might come across as your saw wears in or as it wears down from a sharpening. So straightening and fixing set and things like that. If you're interested in this kind of thing or want to hear more, you should subscribe to the Daily Dispatch. Every day we post content, media content on hand tools and using them, projects and things like that. So sign up for that and we'll see you next time.